I'm staying late again tonight. Emergency neurosurgery, Gregory said, not meeting my eyes. He grabbed his keys, gave a quick glance at his phone, and walked out the door like I was a shadow he had grown used to ignoring. That was the third emergency this week. But I still made dinner. At 45, I thought I had everything life could offer. I was Dr. Helena Whitmore, one of the top microvascular surgeons in Charleston, South Carolina. My career was steady, my patients trusted me, and I returned each evening to a house that smelled like home. Rosemary, lavender oil, lemon-scented floor polish. It was the same two-story house Gregory and I had bought 20 years ago. Back then, it felt like a promise, a future. Gregory was also a surgeon. Neurosurgery, charming, magnetic, the kind of man people noticed the moment he entered a room. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the one behind the curtain, steady hands, long hours, no flair. We had built our life on rhythm. Morning coffee in matching mugs, rushed kisses on the porch, case reviews at midnight, the unspoken comfort of someone always waiting for you at home. Our son Joshua had already moved out by then, working in Atlanta, calling once or twice a week. The house had grown quiet, yes, but it was a warm quiet. Familiar. At least I believed it was. The first cracks were subtle. Gregory started coming home later. No explanation. His smile grew thinner. Our dinners became quieter. He stopped asking how my day was. He stopped noticing when I didn't answer. I told myself it was stress. Surgeons burn out. Maybe he needed space. So I gave it. But then came the day that changed everything. It was a Wednesday. Cloudy. I remember because I had forgotten my umbrella and got caught in the rain walking from the hospital to my car. When I got back to the surgical wing, someone had left an envelope on my desk. No name, just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single note. You deserve to know the truth. He wasn't on call last night. My heart stopped for a second. The night before, Gregory had said he'd be at the hospital all night again. I even packed him his favorite thermos. But someone from within the hospital had taken the risk to tell me otherwise. I sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the note, trying to rationalize anything. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe he swapped shifts. Maybe someone was trying to hurt us. But deep down, I knew. I went home that evening and looked at our life, our matching towels, our photos from Florence, the wine glasses we got as a wedding gift. Everything suddenly looked staged, like props on a set where the show had already ended. That night, I didn't sleep. I waited for Gregory to come home. I watched the clock tick past midnight. At 2:14 a.m., I heard the garage door. He walked in, took off his shoes, and started heading upstairs without a word. I know, I said softly. He paused. Know what? That you weren't on call. He didn't even pretend. He just looked at me, annoyed, like I had ruined his evening. Then he said, You really want to do this now? And that's when I saw it. The line in his jaw, the shift in his posture. Not guilt, not regret, just irritation. The next words out of his mouth would change everything. But I wasn't ready to hear them yet. Not yet. The next morning, he didn't bring it up. He buttered his toast like always, drank his coffee in silence, read emails on his phone, as if the night before hadn't happened, as if our life was still intact, as if I hadn't just found the first loose thread in everything we had built. But I couldn't pretend. Not anymore. I want to know who she is, I said, not even looking up from my tea. Gregory didn't flinch. He set his cup down, folded his arms, and sighed like a man tired of dragging out the inevitable. Her name is Savannah, he said. She's younger, not complicated, no career to obsess over, no pressure, no expectations. He spoke as if he were listing features on a used car, like I was the problem, too driven, too serious, too much. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at the cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter, the ones I had woken up early to bake. Still trying, even in my confusion. How long? I asked. Few months, he replied, like it meant nothing. Look, Helena, it's not that I don't care about you. I just don't want this anymore. It's not working. This, like our marriage, was a subscription he'd forgotten to cancel. I couldn't breathe. I left the house that afternoon, packed a single suitcase, a few clothes, my stethoscope. I remember looking around the life we'd made, the framed photos from our wedding, the bookshelf we built together on a rainy weekend, the ceramic dog Joshua made in second grade. I left it all behind. I stayed in a short-term rental near the historic district. It was small, overpriced, and smelled like bleach. But it was mine, and it was quiet. I waited a week before contacting a lawyer. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace, closure. I believed, foolishly, that Gregory and I could be civil, that after everything, we would divide our assets fairly, move on. I didn't know he had already prepared his endgame. It started with a phone call from my lawyer's assistant. Dr. Whitmore, she said carefully, we're having trouble accessing the financial records. It seems several accounts have been transferred. Transferred? Gregory had drained the joint accounts, moved the investments. Even the house we shared, our home, had quietly been signed over to his name 6 months before he ever said the word divorce. 6 months. He had planned this, strategically, coldly, like a surgery with only one goal: remove the liability and walk away clean. The court date came fast. I stood in front of a judge, believing the truth would protect me. I thought our history, our years together, our shared child had to mean something. But Gregory's lawyers painted me as the bitter, unstable wife trying to cling to assets that were never mine. They brought up my long work hours, my absence at family holidays, my detachment. I sat there as they dissected my life like I was a diagnosis. When the judge read the final ruling, my hands went numb. Gregory kept everything. The house, the savings, even a piece of land in Beaufort my parents had left me. According to the court, all legal, all documented, all signed by me, because I had trusted him. I walked out of the courthouse dizzy, not from anger, but from the sheer disbelief. Gregory passed by me without so much as a glance, and as he leaned in to speak, I braced myself for cruelty. But it was worse than that. "Stay out of my life," he whispered, then walked away, as if I were already gone. I didn't cry on the courthouse steps. I didn't scream or chase after him or beg for something he no longer intended to give. I just stood there, clutching the folder my lawyer handed me, full of legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign script, words that translated simply to this: you lost. I remember walking through downtown Charleston that afternoon in a fog. Tourists were taking selfies by the old iron gates of St. Philip's Church. A street performer was playing jazz by the waterfront. The world was still spinning like nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. The house was no longer mine. The money I thought we saved for retirement, gone. The cottage my father built with his bare hands, the one tucked behind the oaks in Beaufort, transferred to Gregory's name a year ago. All of it signed away in trust, in love, in blindness. I had always believed I was a careful person, a woman of logic. I double-checked prescriptions, triple-checked surgical plans. But I never thought to double-check my husband. That was my real failure. The rental apartment I returned to that evening felt colder than ever. No photos on the walls. No smells of thyme or cinnamon. Just silence and the aching hum of an empty fridge. I opened a bottle of wine and poured a glass, sat on the couch, and stared at the wall until the sun went down. For days, I floated through my shifts like a ghost. I operated. I smiled. I gave patients hope. But inside, something in me had shut off. A fuse had blown, and I didn't know how to replace it. One night, after a 16-hour surgery, I collapsed into the armchair by the window and opened my laptop, more out of habit than purpose. That's when I saw it, a post shared by a nurse on the hospital's staff board. Weekly book circle, a space for stories, thoughts, and quiet company. We meet online Wednesdays at 8 p.m. New readers welcome. Normally, I would have scrolled past it. I was a scientist, not a storyteller. But that night, something in the word quiet called to me. I joined. The first session, I didn't speak. I just watched rows of strangers in little square boxes, faces lit by desk lamps, glasses of tea in hand, talking about lines that had stayed with them from novels I'd never read. One man's name appeared often in the chat. S. Price. He didn't speak either, but people quoted his writing with reverence. Soft, aching words about solitude, about surviving something unnamed. His stories weren't flashy. They didn't offer solutions. They just understood. The next day, I searched for more of his work. Read 3 pieces, then 5, then 7. I couldn't stop. There was one line I read again and again. Some wounds don't bleed. They just echo. I felt something inside me shift. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't open a bottle of wine. I opened my laptop, found his profile, and wrote a message. Your stories feel like standing in a quiet room that finally says, I see you. Thank you. I didn't expect a reply, but it came only minutes later. Thank you. Most people don't say that out loud. Which one spoke to you most? I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. Then I wrote back, and for the first time since losing everything, I said something honest. All of them. But especially the ones where people start over, because I think I might need to. The apartment had beige walls and laminate floors that creaked no matter how softly I walked. The heating unit by the window sputtered, like it had asthma. There was a persistent smell of bleach in the air, like someone had tried too hard to erase what came before. Still, it was mine, or at least it was what I had left. Each evening, I came home to the same chair, the same quiet, the same aching emptiness. I kept my days full with surgeries and patient charts, thinking maybe exhaustion could drown grief. But at night, everything slowed down. Time expanded. Memory filled every inch of space. That's when the conversations with Samuel started to matter. I didn't know much about him, not where he lived, not what he did for work, not even his real name. All I had were his words, and something about them felt sturdy, unpolished but honest. He didn't ask questions he didn't want the answers to. He didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, and when he spoke, it was never more than needed. We talked about books at first. Tolstoy, Baldwin, Morrison, but our messages slowly drifted beyond the pages. I told him I was a surgeon. He told me he used to write under his full name, but didn't anymore. Said publishing made the words feel like currency, not catharsis. I told him I understood that. One night, after a particularly long shift, I came home and collapsed into the armchair with a mug of mint tea. I opened our chat and typed, "Do you ever feel like your life is still happening, but you're not really in it?" He replied almost instantly, "Yes, most days. But then I find one small thing that reminds me I'm still here. A hot drink, a tree that's stubbornly blooming, a sentence that lands just right. Sometimes that's enough." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I wrote, "My husband took everything. The house, the savings, even my family's land." He said, "Stay out of my life," like I was never part of it to begin with. There was a pause. 3 dots flickered on the screen. "I'm sorry," he finally wrote. "You didn't deserve that." It was the simplest sentence, but it broke something open in me. I didn't cry, not then, but I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, the kind of heat that lets you know your heart's still working, even if it's sore. After that, our messages came more often, in the quiet hours after work, over early morning coffee, sometimes in the middle of the day when I needed to step out of the oar and catch my breath. Samuel became a habit I didn't want to break, and he never asked for more than I could give, never pushed, just showed up, at a time when even I wasn't sure I was worth showing up for. One night, as rain beat gently against the kitchen window, I found myself rereading one of his older stories. It was about a man who lost his home, not in a fire or a storm, but through betrayal. And yet, he wrote, somewhere in the rubble, I found the pieces of a self I didn't know I'd misplaced. I sent him one line, that story, it's mine, even if you didn't know it. His reply came a minute later, then maybe it means I wrote it for the right person. It's strange how a person can become part of your life without ever stepping into your world, without ever seeing your face, without ever needing to. Samuel was that for me. We never spoke on the phone, never exchanged photos. He didn't even have a profile picture, just a gray circle with an S. But he knew more about me than most people who sat beside me in staff meetings every week. He once wrote, we don't always need someone to fix the wound. Sometimes we just need someone to sit with us while we bleed. That line stayed with me. His words began to fill the silence of the apartment. In the mornings, before the sun broke through the blinds, I would reread our messages. At night, when the loneliness felt louder than traffic or wind, I'd wait for that little notification to light up. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, like being seen after being invisible for so long. One evening, I told him about a patient I'd lost, an elderly woman, complications during a bypass. Nothing unusual, statistically speaking, but that didn't make it easier. I typed. It felt like I let her down. Like if I had moved just 5 seconds faster, maybe, he answered. You didn't fail her. You stood with her at the edge of everything. That matters more than we'll ever know. No one had ever said something like that to me, not my colleagues, not even Gregory, especially not Gregory. Samuel asked once, cautiously, if I'd ever thought of writing something of my own. I laughed at first. I stitch arteries, not sentences. But he didn't let it go. You know how to repair things that were supposed to be impossible to fix. That takes vision. Words are no different. And the more he said it, the more I began to believe it. I started scribbling in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Not stories, just fragments, lines, observations, questions I didn't know how to ask out loud. Is it still a home if no one is waiting at the door? What do you do when forgiveness feels like betrayal? Why is silence sometimes the loudest cruelty? I didn't share them. Not yet, but I let them live on the page. That was new. And with each day, I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like the slow turning of a tide. I began sleeping again, deep, dreamless sleep that didn't end in gasps or questions. I stopped avoiding mirrors. I walked longer routes to work, just to pass by the magnolia trees blooming along King Street. I was still broken, but I was beginning to recognize the shape of the woman beneath the damage. Then one night, after a particularly raw conversation about fear, about what it means to be left, to be told you're no longer wanted, he wrote, I don't think you're broken, Helena. I think you were just made to carry more than most. And now, you finally get to decide what to carry next. I closed my laptop slowly, held that sentence in my chest like a lifeline, and whispered, thank you, into the empty room. Because somehow, even if he couldn't hear it, I knew he would understand. The idea of meeting him felt absurd at first. We had kept everything so carefully distant, so safely tethered to the space between sentences. But after months of speaking through the screen, something in me needed to know if his presence was as real as his words. It was cold that evening. Charleston doesn't usually dip below freezing, but that night the wind off the harbor felt sharp enough to peel skin. I wore a long wool coat and wrapped my scarf twice around my neck. In my gloved hands, I carried a small thermos of tea. Jasmine, his favorite he once mentioned in passing. We agreed to meet at a small square, tucked behind the historical district, quiet, almost forgotten by tourists, with benches worn smooth by time and weather. I arrived early. Of course I did. I always arrive early when I'm nervous. I watched the shadows stretch across the cobblestones as dusk began to settle. Every passing figure made my breath catch just a little. Then finally I saw him, tall, slightly hunched against the cold, thin frame wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen too many winters. His hands were bare, red from the cold, one clutching the strap of a battered canvas satchel. His face, older than I expected, hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes that had seen too much and spoken of too little. But it was him. I knew at the moment our eyes met. "Helena," he asked softly. I nodded. "Samuel." We both laughed, though it came out more like steam than sound. We sat on the bench, leaving just enough space between us to respect the months we hadn't filled with touch. It wasn't awkward. It was quiet, safe. "I almost didn't come," he said after a pause. "I almost didn't ask," I replied. He looked down at his hands, then at the thermos I held out toward him. "For me?" "Of course," I said. "You saved me more nights than I can count. Tea is the least I could do." He smiled then, small, tired but real. He took a sip, let the warmth settle. For the first few minutes, we didn't say much. Just watched the way the lamplight pooled on the wet pavement. But silence with him had never been empty. It was the kind that gave room for breath. Eventually he said, "You look stronger than I imagined." I tilted my head. "Do I?" He nodded. "And sadder." I didn't deny it. He told me about his life, little pieces he hadn't shared online. How he had once been a published author, nothing big but enough to scrape by. How a series of bad decisions and worse luck had cost him everything. His home, his career, his marriage. How he had learned to sleep in libraries, to eat in shelters, to disappear in a world that pretends to care. But writing, he said, was the one thing that didn't leave. So I kept doing it, even if no one was reading. I whispered. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't before. Hope. Not the loud kind, not the kind that burns, but the kind that flickers, stays. Before we parted that night, I asked if he needed anything. Food, a place to stay, help. He shook his head. "No one's ever looked at me the way you do. That's more than I've had in years." And then he said something I would never forget. "You don't just read my stories, Helena. You see me. And when someone sees, you really sees you. It's hard to keep pretending you're invisible." We stood, and I wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck before saying goodbye. As I walked away, I realized something. That night, I hadn't felt like a woman who'd lost everything. I had felt found. It happened 3 weeks later. A cold Saturday morning that began like any other. Quiet coffee, a long walk, texts from Samuel that made me smile without realizing. I was on call that weekend, scrubbing in for a pediatric case when my phone buzzed again and again in my locker. I didn't check it until the surgery ended. And when I did, my stomach dropped. Fire at Bluefin Cafe. 1 injured. Male. Severe burns. Smoke inhalation. En route to Trauma Bay. There was a name attached. Samuel Price. I ran. By the time I reached the ER, he was already in the bay, unconscious, hooked to machines that screamed warnings in steady rhythm. His hands were bandaged. His face blackened with soot. His chest rose and fell in a labored rhythm beneath a clear oxygen mask. I stood frozen at the threshold, my mind struggling to match this still body to the man whose voice I had only known through stories and messages and one winter night on a park bench. What happened? I asked a nurse, my voice sharper than I meant. She looked up, eyes wide. He pulled a child out of the fire, ran back in when he saw the boy was still inside. The place went up fast. If he hadn't acted, that kid wouldn't have made it. I felt something lodge in my throat. Samuel. Of course he had. Even after everything, after all the world had taken from him, he had run toward the flames for someone he didn't even know. He was a man who believed people were worth saving. I sat by his bed for hours, my fingers lightly resting on his unbandaged wrist, watching every slight shift in his vitals. I whispered things he couldn't hear, or maybe he could. That I was here, that he wasn't alone, that he had always mattered. And then something strange happened. Later that day, a man in a tailored coat appeared at the nurse's station. older, distinguished. His eyes scanned the floor until they landed on me, sitting at Samuel's bedside. He approached with caution but purpose. "Excuse me," he said, voice low, steady. "Are you Dr. Whitmore?" "Yes," I answered slowly. He extended a hand. "Judge Richard Langston. I believe your friend saved my grandson." My heart paused. He explained everything. How he'd been across the street from the cafe, how he'd seen the panic, the fire, the people fleeing. How his grandson, a 6-year-old boy named Henry, had been caught inside. How he had stood frozen on the sidewalk, helpless. And then he saw a man rush back in without hesitation and emerge moments later carrying a coughing, crying boy in his arms. "I saw your friend collapse on the pavement after handing my grandson over to the EMTs," the judge said quietly. "I couldn't let that moment pass without finding him, without thanking him." I looked at the man, this powerful figure who had likely presided over hundreds of lives in courtrooms, and I realized Samuel had just shifted something much bigger than himself. The judge glanced back through the window at Samuel's still form. "He doesn't look like a man the world has been kind to," he murmured. "No," I said, "but he still chose to be kind to it." Judge Langston turned back to me then, his expression shifting into something more curious. "And you? How do you know him?" I hesitated, then said honestly, he reminded me I wasn't invisible, at a time when I needed to believe that more than anything. For a long moment, the judge didn't respond. Then he nodded. "I'd like to do something," he said at last. "Not just to say thank you, but because people like him, and like you, deserve more than a quiet thank you and a quick recovery." And I didn't know it then, but that moment would become the beginning of something neither of us could have imagined. He called the next day. "Judge Langston." I had just returned from checking on Samuel. He was still unconscious but stable when my phone rang. His voice was calm, direct, but not unkind. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, and I did a bit of digging. He wasn't the type to waste time. Within minutes, he had laid out what I hadn't dared hope for in weeks. "Your divorce case," he continued, "it's riddled with procedural gaps. Power of attorney documents signed without adequate counsel, financial transfers made while you were under duress, even that land deed. Legally questionable at best." I stood in my tiny kitchen, one hand braced on the counter, the other gripping the phone like it might disappear. The kettle was whistling behind me, but I didn't move. "You may have grounds for an appeal, Dr. Whitmore," he said. "If you want to pursue it, I can help. Connect you with the right people. Guide you through the process." My mouth went dry. An appeal. A second chance. My first instinct wasn't hope, it was fear. I didn't answer him right away. I needed time. I needed air. I needed clarity. That night, I sat by Samuel's bed again. He was still sedated, his breathing supported by machines, the burns on his arms now hidden beneath sterile wrappings. I watched the steady blip of his heart rate, the quiet rise and fall of his chest, the way even now, unconscious, he looked like he was holding on for someone else. "You almost died," I whispered, brushing a piece of soot-stained hair from his forehead. "You would have died for a child you'd never met." I thought of Gregory, of the judge's offer, of the courtroom that had once gutted me from the inside out. And then I thought of Samuel and what he would have said. He once told me that doing the right thing wasn't about whether it would hurt. It was about whether you could live with yourself if you didn't. The next afternoon, he woke up. Just for a moment, his eyes fluttered open, dry and dazed, locking on mine like it took every ounce of effort. I leaned close, trying not to cry. "Samuel," I whispered, "you're okay. You're safe." His lips barely moved. "You stayed." "I always will." Later that evening, I told him everything. About the judge, the appeal, the past that wouldn't let go. "I don't know if I have the strength," I admitted. "I thought I left all that behind. What if I lose again?" He turned his head toward me, slowly. His voice was rasped, weak, but unmistakable. "You fight for everyone else, Helena. for patience, for strangers, for me. He coughed, then paused before continuing. But what about you? His eyes were glassy, his skin pale, but there was a fierceness in him that made me sit up straighter. Fight for yourself this time. Just once. You don't have to win it all. You just have to stop letting him define what you're allowed to keep. I held his hand in both of mine, and in that moment, the fear didn't disappear, but it stopped being louder than my will. I called Judge Langston the next morning. My voice trembled only slightly when I said, "I'm ready." And just like that, the path I thought I'd buried opened again. He arranged a meeting in his office 2 days later, tucked inside an old courthouse building with creaky floors and the smell of paper and polish. There, he introduced me to an attorney named Ivan Merrick. Late 50s, gray at the temples, quiet eyes that didn't blink often. The kind of man who read depositions like novels and trusted details more than declarations. "I've reviewed your case," Ivan said calmly. "It won't be easy, but it's winnable." I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for a year. He walked me through the appeal process, the paperwork, the timelines, the need for new evidence. He was honest, it would take months, maybe longer. Gregory's legal team was polished, connected. They'd built their case carefully. "But you have something now you didn't have before," Ivan said. "You have eyes on your side, people watching, a judge willing to speak, and the truth." It sounded simple, but it felt revolutionary. I spent the next several weeks buried in old files, appointment books, copies of bank statements I hadn't looked at since Joshua left for college. I met with Ivan every Tuesday afternoon in a quiet corner of a downtown coffee shop. He asked precise questions. I gave precise answers. Every time I opened a drawer, another memory fell out. The receipts from our anniversary trip to Florence. The handwritten list Gregory and I had made when deciding whether to try for a second child. Letters my father wrote before he passed, leaving me the Beaufort land with one instruction. Only let go of it if you no longer need roots. Some nights, I'd come home too drained to eat. I'd kick off my shoes and drop into the armchair, every cell aching with the weight of everything I was digging back up. And every time, without fail, Samuel would message. "How's your lawyer?" he asked once. "Still sane?" "Barely," I replied, "but he listens better than most therapists." That's promising. If he ever retires, I'm ready to pick up the torch. I know how to wear a good suit and frown dramatically in court. I laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in days. Samuel's healing was slow, but steady. The bandages on his hands were removed. The burns faded to pale, glossy scars. He walked with a slight limp, but he stood taller now, straighter. We met often at the park and quiet bookstores, sometimes at my apartment where I'd cook and he'd pretend not to judge my seasoning choices. He was the one who kept me grounded. "You know," he said one evening, watching me underline a document for the 4th time, "you never once asked Gregory to be less than who he was. You just trusted he'd never weaponize your trust." I looked up. "Now it's time to use that same strength for you." I nodded, not because I believed I would win, but because for the first time I knew I deserved to try. 6 months after Judge Langston offered to reopen my case, the hearing was finally set. The morning of the hearing, I dressed slowly. Dark navy suit, low heels, no makeup beyond what was necessary to keep the exhaustion from showing. I stood in front of the mirror and rehearsed my breathing. Not my testimony, not my arguments, just my breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with humidity despite the early hour. Charleston spring had arrived too early, and I could feel it pressing against my collarbone. Judge Langston was already inside. He wouldn't be presiding. That would be another judge. But his presence still meant everything. Ivan walked beside me, briefcase in hand, calm as a lake. As I entered the courtroom, I saw Gregory. He looked polished, calm, smug even, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, hair carefully styled. He didn't even look at me, just nodded once at his attorney like he was confirming a dinner reservation. I sat down across from him. For a second, I felt myself slipping. That old, familiar instinct to shrink in his presence, to second guess, to flinch at his coldness. But then I looked past him, just for a second, and saw Samuel, standing quietly in the back row, arms folded, eyes locked on mine. And I remembered who I was now. The proceedings began. Gregory's team moved first, just like last time. They were crisp, professional, and clinical. They brought out signatures, timestamps, legal precedents, and argued that everything was documented, verified, and disputable. They made it sound like I had agreed to being erased. Then Ivan stood. He was not theatrical, not loud, just precise. He walked the court through inconsistencies, financial transfers made on days when I was in surgery, documents filed without witness signatures, accounts shifted during emotionally coercive periods, including the week of my father's funeral. He highlighted subtle discrepancies in signatures, showed evidence that many of the legal authorizations had been slipped into innocuous paperwork I'd signed under the impression they were routine tax filings. And then he played an audio recording, a voicemail from Gregory's paralegal, accidentally saved in an old drive. She won't even know what she signed. Just make sure it's buried with the others. The room went silent. Gregory's face shifted, not entirely, but enough. His jaw clenched. His fingers tapped against the desk. The judge turned to me. "Dr. Whitmore, do you have anything to add?" I stood slowly. My knees were shaking, but my voice was clear. "I loved my husband," I said. "I believed in him. I never imagined that trust would be used against me. I didn't ask for more than my share. I asked for fairness. And what I received was betrayal disguised as paperwork." Gregory's lawyer objected. Something about emotional manipulation. But the judge let me finish. "I am not here to punish him," I continued. "I am here because no woman should have her life stolen by the man who once promised to protect it." The judge looked down, shuffled through papers, and asked both sides to remain silent as he deliberated. 5 minutes. 5 excruciating minutes. And then he looked up. "Based on the evidence provided," he said, voice firm, "this court finds that the initial property division was conducted with intent to defraud. A reversal is hereby granted. Assets are to be redistributed in accordance with marital equity." That included the Beaufort land, half of the investment accounts, and a formal audit of every financial transfer he had initiated in the last 2 years. I didn't hear the rest. All I heard was the thunder of blood rushing to my ears, the tremble in my hands as relief flooded every nerve. Ivan placed a quiet hand on my shoulder. I looked back. Samuel was smiling. Gregory, on the other hand, was not. His composure fractured. He turned to his attorney, whispering furiously, but no one listened. This time no one listened to him, because this time the room had heard me. Later, I heard from a former colleague that Gregory's reputation had taken a hit. Some of his patients asked to be transferred. His name, once spoken with admiration in surgical halls, now echoed with quiet judgment. He had won the game of appearances, until the truth showed up in court transcripts. I walked out of that courtroom not just with a ruling, but with my name restored. For months, I had walked with my head down, my shoulders curled inward like I was apologizing for something I didn't understand. But that morning, for the first time in nearly a year, I stood up straight, not angry, not proud, just whole. Samuel met me on the courthouse steps. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled me into an embrace that felt more like a landing than a celebration. "You did it," he whispered. "No," I said, pulling back, smiling. "We did." I returned to work the next day. No fanfare, no announcements, just my name back on the ID badge, my coat back on the hook outside the "or," my hands back where they belonged, in the middle of something delicate and vital. That week, I closed 3 cases, 2 successful limb reconstructions, 1 high-risk vascular repair. My surgical team didn't say it out loud, but they felt the shift. I saw it in the way they looked at me, not with pity, not with discomfort, but with recognition. They hadn't lost me. I had just stepped away for a while, and now I was back. A few days later, I was called into the chief of surgery's office, Dr. Harrington, a man known more for stern silence than warm compliments, stood behind his desk with a rare flicker of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We've been reviewing some changes in department structure," he began. I braced myself. "And we'd like you to consider leading the reconstructive microvascular unit. It's yours if you want it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Are you sure?" I asked, not out of doubt in my skill, but disbelief in the timing. He nodded. "No one else I trust more. And frankly, after everything you've been through, I think the team could use someone who remembers what fighting really looks like." I walked out of his office with the offer letter still clutched in my hand. That night, I told Samuel over dinner. Pasta, badly cooked, but neither of us cared. "You're going to take it, right?" he asked. I looked at him, candlelight flickering between us. I already said yes. He grinned. "Good," he said, "because the world doesn't need more titles. It needs leaders who've bled a little." His words stayed with me. Gregory never reached out. Maybe pride, maybe shame, or maybe some people just vanish when their masks fall away. Over the following weeks, I began shaping the department into something new, something human. I restructured shift rotations so the junior staff could sleep. I installed a small break room library, filled half with medical texts, half with fiction Samuel helped me pick out. I scheduled monthly check-ins, not evaluations, just conversations. Healing people takes more than skill. It takes presence. And for the first time in a long time, I had it to give. I wasn't working to outrun pain anymore. I was working from a place of clarity, of reclaimed identity. Every morning, as I stood in the operating room and pulled on my gloves, I felt something familiar settle into my chest. Not obligation, not survival. Purpose. And this time it belonged entirely to me. The first time Samuel mentioned writing a book, it was barely more than a passing thought. We were sitting in my living room, the windows open to the soft hum of Charleston's early summer, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in from the courtyard below. "I've been thinking," he said, tracing the rim of his mug with one finger. "Maybe it's time to put them all together." "Your stories?" I asked. He nodded almost shyly. "They've just lived in scattered places for so long. Blog posts, forums, notebooks. Maybe they deserve a spine." I smiled. "They deserve shelves, bookstores, readers." He looked up at me then, really looked, and I could see the war in his eyes. The part of him that still didn't believe he deserved to be seen. The part that had slept under bridges and written by flashlight in public libraries. The part that thought stories were only valuable if they made someone else money. "You once said books can heal," I reminded him gently. "I think it's time you let yours do that. For someone else. The way they did for me." He didn't answer then, but he started writing the next morning. It was messy at first. Old files stitched together, fragments rewritten by hand, drafts lost and found and retyped from memory. But piece by piece, the shape of something whole began to emerge. And I watched him change as he wrote. There was more certainty in his voice, more light behind his eyes. He spent long afternoons in cafes, tucked into corners with headphones and a laptop held together by duct tape and stubbornness. He worked through the night sometimes, then showed up at my door with ink-stained fingers and a grin like he hadn't felt tired in years. 3 months later, the manuscript was done. He printed it at the local copy shop and handed it to me in a manila envelope like it was something sacred. "I want you to read it first," he said, "before anyone else does." I opened it slowly. The first page was blank. The second held the title in simple black font, The Shape of Silence, and beneath it a single line of dedication. "For H.W., for seeing me before I saw myself." I couldn't speak. I didn't try to. I read it in one night. Every word, every pause, every echo of a man who had once written in shadows. His voice was all there, gentle, wounded, unwavering. But it wasn't just his story. It was ours. A few weeks later, a small independent publisher picked it up. Judge Langston had connected us to someone he trusted in New York, and to everyone's surprise, especially Samuel's, they said yes. When the book came out that fall, it didn't explode. It whispered, but it whispered into the right hearts. Letters started arriving, emails, messages from people who'd survived losses, betrayals, breakdowns, people who thought they were too far gone, too broken, too invisible. They thanked him for naming their pain. And in doing so, he helped them begin to unname it. Samuel never asked for recognition. He still didn't love attention. But I caught him one night standing in the back of a bookstore, watching someone pick up his book and hold it like it meant something. He didn't say a word, just turned to me and whispered, "That's enough." And it was because what we'd found through ashes, through grief, through quiet pages and courtroom battles wasn't just healing. It was voice. It was presence. It was beginning again. The idea came quietly, like most important things in our lives had. We were sitting at a small cafe near the Battery, early evening, the city dimming into soft golds and purples. Samuel's book had been out for 2 months. He was still uncomfortable when people recognized him, still downplaying the impact of what he'd created. But I could see it in his posture, the way he stood straighter now, the way he walked into rooms like he belonged in them. "You ever wonder," I said, stirring honey into my tea, "how many people like us are out there right now?" He looked up. "You mean?" People who were just one conversation away from giving up, one hand away from falling through the cracks. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I wonder that every day." And that's when it clicked. It wasn't enough to rebuild our own lives. Not when we had been carried, by chance, by grace, by the stubborn kindness of a few good people. Not when we knew firsthand how easy it was to disappear. What if we built something? I asked. Not just a donation, something lasting. A place where people who've lost their footing can be seen again. He tilted his head. "A fund." "A foundation," I said, the word surprising even me. "For second chances." Samuel didn't blink. He just nodded. And just like that, the Whitmore Price Foundation was born. We started with nothing but the name. But that name carried weight. With Judge Langston's guidance, we filed the paperwork, structured the board, gathered allies. I handled the legal logistics, the nonprofit filings, the calls to potential donors and hospital administrators. Samuel wrote the language, grants, mission statements, calls for applications. His words were always the anchor. Our goal was simple: to support people who had fallen through the cracks, not just financially, emotionally, professionally, people who had lost homes, jobs, reputations, people in recovery, people starting over, people who, like us, once thought they were invisible. We launched a platform for artists, writers, caregivers, anyone with a voice and a need for space to use it. We partnered with community colleges to offer tuition relief. We created mentorship programs, legal workshops, emergency stipends. Within 6 months, we had our first 10 recipients. I remember the awards ceremony, a small auditorium at the library downtown, modest but full of light. The 10 stood on stage, some trembling, some beaming, all changed. Not because of the money, but because someone had looked at them and said, "We see you. We believe in your tomorrow." One young woman, an aspiring playwright who'd aged out of foster care, stood at the microphone with tears in her eyes and said, "I thought maybe I had missed my life. Thank you for giving it back." I looked at Samuel then, seated beside me in the front row, and saw it in his face. Pride, humility, awe. "I didn't think we'd get here," he whispered. "We didn't," I whispered back. "We built here." And I realized this was the legacy, not the verdicts or the bestsellers or even the hospital wings. It was the reach, the quiet, rippling impact of healing made visible. And it all began with a whisper in a courtroom, and someone brave enough to answer it. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as I was locking up the office. My phone buzzed once, then again. It was Joshua. He rarely called during the workday, let alone twice. My heart picked up speed. "Mom," he said, breathless, "you're going to want to sit down." I laughed nervously. "You're not in trouble, are you?" "No, no," he chuckled. "Quite the opposite. Well, you're going to be a grandmother." Silence, then breath. The kind that swells deep in the chest before tears can follow. "Oh," I whispered. "Oh, Joshua." There was so much I wanted to say in that moment. So many memories of him as a boy. First steps, scraped knees, the time he asked me at age 7 if I loved being his mom more than I loved being a doctor. I remembered saying, "Yes, but you make me better at both." I hung up the phone and stood alone in the dark hallway, hand pressed over my heart like it might burst from the warmth. When I told Samuel, he just smiled and said, "She's going to be one lucky kid." "She?" I asked. "I don't know," he shrugged. "Just a feeling." We started making plans. Small ones at first. A weekend trip to Asheville, a cabin near the Smoky Mountains. Just the two of us, a fire and silence, not the lonely kind, but the kind we'd earned. Samuel suggested Europe next. "You've stitched people back together across 3 decades, he said one night. "I think you've earned a little Italy." He was writing again, not just for himself now, but for others. His second book was already in edits, and he was being invited to speak at schools and community centers. He didn't love the spotlight, but he'd learned how to let his story be a doorway instead of a wound. As for me, I continued leading my department, mentoring new surgeons, making space for rest and breath in a system that often forgot both. I didn't work to escape anymore. I worked because I could choose to, because it filled me, not consumed me. And every night, no matter how long the day had been, I came home to a man who made tea without asking, who let silence stretch without needing to fix it, who reminded me, simply by staying, that love doesn't always arrive in fire. Sometimes it grows in ashes. One evening, months later, we sat on our little balcony beneath the Charleston stars, the city humming gently in the background. I rested my head on his shoulder, and he laced his fingers through mine. "Did you ever think," he murmured, "that life would look like this?" I didn't answer right away, because no, I hadn't. I never imagined that being broken open could be the very thing that made me whole. I never imagined that losing everything would become the doorway to finding not just someone else, but myself. I looked up at him, his face worn but warm, his eyes still full of quiet fire. "No," I said, "but I think it's exactly how it was meant to be." And as the stars blinked above us, and the breeze carried the scent of sea salt and jasmine through the city we both now called home, I knew this wasn't a second chapter. It was the story I was always meant to live, the one I chose to write, with my own voice. And this time, no one would erase me from the page.